This is our discussion of diversity for the agroecology class. We're going to discuss diversity-based whole systems in sustainable agriculture, and this will be in contrast to monocultures. I think we're aware that industrial ag tends to focus on this part of the agroecosystem, on species and population, and actually has focused very well, determined how to grow corn, for example, in appropriate densities without weeds. But sustainable ag takes us to another level. It takes us beyond species and population of that species. It takes us to the community level and also to the agroecosystem level. So we look at populations in their communities, interacting with each other, and in their environment. So it gives us much more of a holistic view, including biotic components, living components, and abiotic, including the environment. If we compare industrial ag to sustainable ag, I think we can see that we're often just talking about parts in industrial ag. It's more of a reductionist, specialized focus, and it can also be viewed as a simplified or a system that controls and eliminates instead of manages. In contrast, when we look at sustainable agriculture, we are trying to look at it more as a whole system, a holistic view, because we're aware that there's agriculture, biological systems are not simplified. They're actually very complex and diverse. And sometimes when you change one factor, you may not realize how it impacts other factors. So the focus is really more of a management type focus, managing our pests, for example, instead of trying to control or completely eliminate them. We've discussed during the agroecology class that high diversity is needed for beneficial interactions. An example of this is natural pest management. For example, if we look at a problem that flea beetles have damaged broccoli, often when you see brassicas in the field, like broccoli, kale, cabbage, they often have lots of little tiny holes in them, and that indicates a problem with flea beetles. One way to control flea beetles is to intercrop a weedy type mustard plant. Mustard is also a brassica, and it has generally pretty broad leaves, small flowers here, and it acts as a mechanism to a trap crop that the flea beetles go to the mustard, which is not necessarily your cash crop, and that pulls them away from the cash crop, which is broccoli in this case. Another application of using high diversity for beneficial interactions is biological weed control, looking at grazing habits of animals. For example, to control kudzu or other invasive species, goats can eat it. Goats can eat brush, and it's highly nutritious for them. And so the benefit is that they control the brush. Wheat or geese used to be used in the past, before many herbicides were developed, to control young grasses. So that you don't actually want the geese, walking through your main crop. They've got big webbed feet, but you can, in this case, I think they're being used after the crop has been harvested. But you could set up little fences, barriers, some way to keep the geese out of the crop if you're actively growing it at that time. But geese do like the very young, nutritious blades of grass, and they can control it. We need to look at diversity not just genetically species-wise, we need to look at it from a larger view. So we look at ecological diversity. And it is much more than just the number of species in a community. Usually when we talk about biodiversity, we are referring to number of species and then their genetic variability. But when we look at ecological diversity, we're looking at vertical. That might also include different levels of vegetation. Here is a tall canopy in a wooded area beside crops. A lower canopy, there's also bushes. This is corn growing here. And vertical also includes below ground, the microorganisms. It can also include a horizontal type spatial diversity, and we'll talk a bit more about that, but what is the variation of species across an area in a community? Structural diversity includes the different trophic levels, for example, different biological niches, and there's also functional diversity, which, as we know, ecological functions include things like nutrient cycling, effective solar capture, hydrological cycling. So it's interesting when organisms interact in multiple functional ways, that they might be helping to capture more sunlight at the same time that they're helping to cycle nutrients. An example of nitrogen-fixing plants. Temporal, seasonal type diversity also exists, and I've shown a picture here of shade-grown coffee in the tropics. And I think I've mentioned I lived 2 years in Costa Rica in the Peace Corps, so I got to see how frequently the nurse trees, these are nitrogen-fixing trees, are cut. They're pollard usually at the beginning of the rainy season to reduce fungus and give the coffee more light. And then the trees do grow back over the season. So this is another type of diversity. To look at the scale of diversity, and this helps us understand a bit more the spatial horizontal type diversity, we look at gamma, beta, and alpha diversity. Gamma diversity is across a region, and that might be more of a human-influenced region where there's pasture, wooded area, there might be brush on a slope, and there's actually, that means that there's quite a bit of variation across an area. Naturally, though, you'll often see very large expanses of grassland or natural forest that might be low in terms of the gamma diversity, just several types of landscape, but it actually could have a very high alpha diversity, which is the individual grass species. It's probably not just grass, it's probably legumes and many different other families. So gamma is across a region. Beta diversity is on a smaller scale, which is usually within a community. Alpha is diversity in a single location. So here we can see 4 different types of crops planted in a field, and this is a good example of intercropping, where you might put broccoli in with lettuce and maybe sunflower, several different crops together. And you can see they vary close to a central point. Beta diversity, you can have these same types of crops. You can still have lettuce, broccoli, and sunflower, but you plant them in strips. So it's really more of an example of strip cropping. So you can still have high diversity. It's just whether it's alpha diversity or beta diversity. And strip cropping can actually be easier to harvest when it comes time to harvest. If you're using sustainable mechanized systems, you would drive, you would harvest this strip and then harvest this strip. Nature is high in diversity. And it's interesting that diversity in agroecosystems can be hard to maintain compared to natural systems because of the amount of disturbance. We tend to disturb our systems a lot through harvest, for example, or through plowing, and we often keep taking the system back to a basic immature level and starting over. We'll talk more about this when we discuss in one of our future topics, disturbance and succession. So it can be hard to maintain, but it's important because diversity is what leads to resistance in our agroecosystems, in all of our systems. You know, we would like to see more resistance and less vulnerability right now and during the pandemic with human health. So resistance can really means resistance to change. Resilience is another thing you get from diversity, and that is the ability of the system to recover. And that's what succession is. Again, our next topic next week is going to be on succession, on recovery. And this can return the system to its structure and functioning that it previously had before the disturbance. Robustness is another feature that we look for, which is a real self-regulating form of the different types of processes, nutrient cycling, solar capture, that it can be self-regulating, and it may not be as efficient as some of the industrial systems, but robustness, the ability to bounce back, self-regulate, last, even transform, that's what we get. It's, you know, the price we pay for efficiency, but we can get very increased robustness. The value of agroecosystem diversity, this is important to look at. I remember I actually do a lot of grant writing in sustainable ag, and I was thought it was just a wonderful list when I read this in our textbook, and it makes a lot of sense that the value of diversity is that you have better functioning. You do have better nutrient cycling, hydrological cycling interactions. You have more beneficial interactions and coexistence among species. And that means that plants are able to, nitrogen fixers can fix nitrogen. It may be that we have various trophic levels, so we don't just have insect pests, we also have beneficial insects that are predators of those pests. So these are important beneficial interferences. It also means better resource utilization. For example, when I have looked at the garden on campus this week, you know, there's not many people working in the garden right now because we're off campus, but I noticed that we have some areas that are growing back now, being colonized, and if you have some good useful species already within the system, it's going to be those species that colonize instead of noxious weeds. So I was pleased to see some of our favorite flowers that we like, some of our Johnny Jump Ups coming up in one garden bed, a lot of calendula, which is the Mexican marigold, and it's beautiful cut flower, but it also, people do dry calendula for medicinal purposes. Also some Nigella is growing, a flower, again another cut flower that we actually use quite a bit. So with diversity, you get useful species instead of the noxious ones. Diversity is also important to reduce farmers' market enterprise risk. It may be if one crop fails that you have plenty of other crops. You may have eggs to sell if you also raise chickens if your carrots don't do well. And this does give more ecosystem services also, diversity. I included a picture here from some work I did several years ago in Mexico. This is visiting a home garden in Campeche, state of Mexico, and visited this farmer, Don Victor. And, you know, I was really impressed with the amount of productivity, crops, and animals just right around his homestead. This is some type of long bean that he told me about, and you can see how long that is. A very long bean. He also had chickens, he had rabbits, he had goats, pigs just right around his homestead. We will talk more about tropical home gardens as having a very high level of diversity, but in temperate areas like ours, I would say we also do see that with some of our homestead and permaculture designs. Let's look at the practices that build diversity in ag. It may be practices where you're adding in new crops. It may be that or new species, that you're intercropping, that you're adding hedgerows or buffer strips. We've talked about cover cropping. Crop rotation, of course, is important to build diversity, and it also helps confuse pests. You don't want to plant potatoes in the same place every year, or tomatoes, because those are both in the nightshade family. You do need to rotate and grow a different family, like brassicas. And we have studied some of our crop families, so you're able to do an effective rotation. Adding livestock also helps build diversity. Strip cropping is a way to reorganize species in a system, and we saw the example of beta versus alpha diversity. You can also add diversity building practices such as rest period or high organic matter inputs, such as incorporating crop residue, and cover cropping can also help with this. Sometimes you just need to stop doing certain practices that are diversity reducing, like you need to reduce your amount of tillage. You need to reduce your amount of chemical use. It's also important to keep in mind agroecosystem design as you're trying to build diversity. And our textbook has a very useful section at the end of this chapter to discuss how to encourage beneficial organisms to establish in the agroecosystem. And the author talks about the importance. He uses vineyards because he actually grows grapes in California, but the importance of having natural areas close to your farmed areas, and even including a biological highway or a natural type corridor right into your fields, in his case into the vineyards. And it needs to be plants that can help attract beneficial insects, and those types of plants do include often plants with a small flower for beneficials that have small mouth parts. So yarrow is an example, alyssum, Queen Anne's lace is one that we do encourage in this area. So, and we sometimes do plant a good bug blend. It might be it's actually a commercial product that you can buy that has a lot of clovers, for example, that attract beneficial insects. So it can be very beautiful plantings also to help attract these beneficials that can then eat the pest insects in your field. And we don't have as much time, since we've had to reduce our content, to talk about ecological pest management. We do offer a class on that, but it's important to learn that many types of spiders are going to be beneficial on farms. The tachinid fly, ladybugs are beneficial. So are lacewings, praying mantis, and several different types of soldier bugs. And you can see in these pictures, praying mantis actually eating a pest, and this picture shows a ladybug eating aphids. So, these are excellent ways to control pests in agroecology. I'd like to discuss a way to assess some of the benefits of adding diverse systems, such as intercropping. And in this chapter, you notice that there are different methods. The Simpson Index, there's different methods of measuring diversity. But we're looking more at an application here. We're looking at the land equivalent ratio is what we look at to show the benefit, analyze the benefit of intercropping. And this is, there's tables in your chapter to read about how to calculate the land equivalent ratio. And I want to give a summary here that what we do is we take crop A and crop B, if we're growing it together, and we would compare what the yield is in the monoculture if you grow crop A and crop B separately. And then we also compare what the yield would be when they're intercropped, when they're grown in a polyculture. So to get the land equivalent ratio, this is a formula. You divide the yield in the polyculture by the yield in the monoculture for each crop. So in this case, crop A, we put 1,000 over 1,200. This is kilograms per hectare of yield. And we can see that our partial land equivalent ratio is 0.83. So it may be that this crop, you get more yield when you grow it as a monoculture, but when you add all of these partial amounts up, in this case too, crop B, you don't get as high a yield in a polyculture as you do in a monoculture. But when you add up these partial land equivalent ratios, you actually get a number that's above 1. And so that means that you actually get a higher yield when you plant these together. Because of the beneficial interactions, it's a way to see what level of beneficial interactions you have due to the diversity. And it also means that you can use less land. And this is an incredible efficiency measure, because I think you're aware that our arable land around the world is so limited now that we keep degrading land, we keep turning it to development, to cities, and we really need to safeguard the arable land that we have and use it well. So this is an example of wheat being grown with soybeans. Let's assess the benefits of the Three Sisters intercrop. We've discussed this semester this indigenous intercrop of corn, beans. These are usually going to be, some type of lima bean, velvet bean. It's generally not soybeans. We're talking about beans that are from the Americas. And squash, another crop from the Americas. So they actually do better when they're grown together than when they're grown separately. The corn in particular does a lot better. Look at the kilograms of corn per hectare in polyculture is higher than the kilograms of corn per hectare in a monoculture. It's not as high here for beans and for squash, but it's very high for corn, probably because the beans are nitrogen fixer and helps the corn. I would encourage you to pause the video now and do the calculations yourself. You need to fill out this column here. Pause your video and complete the column because you need to calculate what the land equivalent ratio is. I'm telling you it's going to be positive. It's going to be above 1, but I want you to see how to do that. So I guess I'll pause a minute. But you pause your video and give yourself more time. And I can't actually write in here. I can't write in the number in this view that I have, but this number that you would write in here when you put when you divide the 1720 over the 1230, you get 1.4. When you divide the 110 over the 600, you get 0.18. And when you divide the 80 for squash, this is the amount of yield in the polyculture by the yield in the monoculture, you get 0.18. And so that adds up to 1.77. And that number is above 1. If you were to get a number less than 1 then your yields go down so much that you need to plant monocultures. But that is certainly going to take up more land. But in this case, we actually see a higher yield. And 1.77 means that you would need 77% more land to plant these as monocultures. So it's actually just a great measure of efficiency and the value of diversity. There's a table in your book too that shows that whole intercrop. One thing I want to point out here about intercropping is that it might be a substitution type intercrop. In this case, if we're looking at sunflowers and soybeans, they're usually planted about 1.5 feet apart. This is 0.5 meters. So in this case, you can see that the sunflower is planted 0.5 meters apart, the rows. The soybean, in this case too, is planted 0.5 meters apart. If you're doing a substitution type intercrop, then you just put, you leave out, some of your soybean rows and you put in sunflower rows. And it's using the same amount of land. So this is a substitution type intercrop. An addition type intercrop is that your sunflower and soybeans, these are the distance they are apart in a monoculture. But when you put them together, you're not just substituting, you're actually adding them in. So you can see that your soybean here is planted 1.5 feet apart as it was here, but the sunflower has been added in to the rows between, and so you're not using more land, you're using the same amount of land that you used with soybeans. But you can often do this. It's often the land equivalent ratio is going to be above 1, and that means that the beneficial interactions, the coexistence is sufficient that you can do this. And so it's a very good use of land. Looking at ecological diversity as an overview, it's important to ensure that our farms are diverse. But it's also important to ensure that our landscapes are diverse. And that means not converting all of our land to cities and concrete monoculture of crops or concentrated animal feeding operations, which are the large-scale livestock operations. We need areas that are still productive, even though they're influenced by us, areas of reduced human influence. And that's where agricultural sustainable ag comes into play, because not all of our systems can be natural. We do need to produce food, but having a diversity of these does lead to ecosystem services, and this is the type of ecosystem service that we need to see now in these times to, for example, help reduce pandemics. So ecological diversity is a key feature of sustainable ag to look at. That's the end of our discussion today.